What is a DDC, and do you need one? That's an interesting question, and hopefully this video helps you to understand what it does and whether it makes sense in your system. A DDC is a digital-to-digital converter. Its job is essentially to provide three benefits. First of all, it provides isolation from the sender to the receiver to get rid of any noise, especially things like USB, power line noise, and such things like that. It can occasionally do reclocking internally. It doesn't have to, but in most cases it does, which means you can potentially get a much better clock here than you got in the original source device. And if you are passing it on as I squared S, again, that is going to be a nice pure clock signal that can be easily understood by your DAC. So even if it's not a great clock, the fact that it's an independent clock on a separate line on the cable can be very helpful. It also does a good job of converting between different kinds of digital interfaces. Let's say, for example, you have a computer that you want to use to play your music. It has a USB output, but the DAC, for some reason, does not have a USB input. Many DACs, I would even say most DACs released now do, but there are many older DACs that do not. In my case, I happen to have a benchmark DAC2 HGC, and it does have a USB input, but it requires an update that is always felt more onerous than I wanted to be bothered to do. So I've always just given it SPDIF directly, even though I could do a few backflips and get it to accept USB directly. So in that case, a digital-to-digital converter is a good thing for going from one type of interface to another. We're going to talk about a few contenders today, and it's a bit of a Davy and Goliath situation. And one of these devices isn't even strictly speaking a DDC, although it does perform some of the same operations that a DDC does. So I wanted to include it just for comparison's sake. The first item is the JDS Labs Synapse. It's a nice little red thing, and it goes from USB to USB. So it's not changing interface types, but its primary purpose is galvanic isolation. That simply means we are trying to electrically separate the source, which in this case could be a very noisy computer, from the DAC, which doesn't want to hear all that noise and have to deal with it. So that's the purpose of it. The cost is very low. I think it's approximately $70 US. You can buy it directly from JDS Labs. They'll send it to you. They have a version of this. This is the version that's the aluminum exterior, but they've got one that is a plastic exterior that I think is $10 less if you want to save a few dollars. It's using a new chip from Texas Instruments that does this little galvanic isolation trick, and it is cheap enough, I think, as a chip that you'll probably see this chip showing up in a lot of other digital devices down the road as a one-stop solution. Normally doing galvanic isolation properly can be quite expensive. This makes it a breeze. And this is one of the first products apparently that has that particular chip. The interesting thing here is usually when you plug a USB source, your streamer, into a DDC, you suddenly see that DDC as the destination. And then the DDC turns around and talks to the next step. In the case of the JDS Labs Synapse, interestingly enough, it is invisible to your communication stream. Your source device still sees your DAC as the ultimate destination. I'm not sure what magic it's using to make that work, but that is a little bit strange for this particular device. The power for this thing comes from your host itself. So your computer or your Raspberry Pi or whatever device you're using that's sending the data via USB will provide power to this device, and then it's able to take that power to get its circuitry running and still galvanically isolate it somehow to then pass it on to the next step. Strictly speaking, I don't think this has a reclocker in it. I don't think it has a separate clock, but I'm really not 100% aware of all of the internals of that Texas Instrument chip. So it may be doing some aspect of reclocking, but I suspect not. The thing to recognize with USB data is it is asynchronous. So the data is not sent at the same time that the music is played. Like the data isn't sort of saying, oh, you're playing the next measure. Well, here's the next measure of the data. Here's the next 5 seconds of the data. It's sending it in packets. And if there's a problem with a packet, it could theoretically ask it to resend if it recognizes that there's a mistake in it. And then the device you've sent the USB data to turns around and it plays that from a little buffer and it reclocks it internally. Whereas with SPDIF, the clock is the external clock and it's playing it as it's being streamed down the wire. With USB, you've got that disconnect, the asynchronous disconnect. So because this thing talks, it looks like it's talking directly to the other device, maybe this thing mirrors that other device's identity. Maybe that's how it does it. But because of the asynchronous quality of it, I suspect that that is being maintained throughout and that this device is probably not reclocking the data per se. And it would be silly either way because, again, it's asynchronous data. It's going to be buffered and then reclocked regardless. It's just the nature of USB. So that's the first device. Second device is the SMSL PO100 Pro. And this device, again, has a USB input. It is powered by the USB source, just like the JDS Labs Synapse. And it outputs any of 3 different options. It's got an I2S output, which, as I say, I think is the best option if your DAC will support it. It has the coaxial RCA output, SPDIF, and then it's also got the optical Toslink SPDIF. The device has a couple of switches in the bottom in terms of the modes and such things you want to set. I plugged it in initially and just stuck it into my Ferrum Wandla DAC. Seemed to work perfectly well, music coming out sounding correct. I thought, great, this is the right pin out, it's all good. But then I realized that my stereo image was backwards and left was right and right was left. So I ended up flicking through from USB mode 1 to mode 2, and that solved the problem, and suddenly the music was correct. And so that's just something you may have to twiddle with that a bit. I could have potentially changed the setting on my DAC instead, but in this case, I flicked the switch and the problem was solved. With this device, it does actually have reclocking internally with a phase management handling on it to try and get that clocking to be correct. The device is very inexpensive, though. It's only, I think it was $60 US, even cheaper than the JDS Labs Synapse. So I don't know how good a quality all of these things are, but ultimately the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I was surprised at how much this was able to make a difference to the presentation of the music. So that's our second device. The third device is the Denafrips Gaia, and it is the Goliath in this particular comparison. It is worth roughly 20 to 30 times as much money as these other devices. As I say, the JDS, or sorry, the SMSL is about $60. I think the new price on the Denafrips Gaia is something like $1,800. So that is literally 30 times as much. So it's really a bit of an unfair comparison, but because they theoretically do the same thing, I thought that was worth a comparison to see, is there really a difference when you spend more money? And I'll get into that a little bit more later. So I decided to go ahead and do a comparison, and I started out with a real Davian Goliath solution here. My first match was the Synapse, which is not even really a DDC. Versus the, because of course it's going USB to USB, so it's still my own DAC doing the USB, doing its own clocking and everything else. I compared it against the Gaia. And first of all, I just did a baseline listening of just USB straight from my source. And my source, by the way, in this case, I was using a variety of Pi 4, Raspberry Pi 4 sources, all running the same software, all synchronized up so that I could switch back and forth and immediately hear the differences. There was no time change from one to the next. And I could easily switch back and forth many times to confirm the differences that I heard. And so I first of all said, let's just do straight USB. and then let's use USB with the Synapse, and I actually used two different DACs that were the same for this purpose, just to see what ended up happening from that perspective. And what I did find was the Synapse did create a cleaner signal. It appears to have done the job it's supposed to do in terms of getting rid of some of that source noise. So the sound was cleaner. I found the background was quieter. The bass was tighter sounding, and a lot of times when you have tighter bass, you can get it can seem a bit smaller just because it's not bloated and smeared. It's so tight that it can sometimes seem a little bit smaller. And if you want your bass a little more bloated, which a lot of people like that, then you may find you don't like the effect. I found that it sounded, I'm going to say flatter, but I'm not talking about in a soundstage perspective. I'm saying it seemed a bit, almost a bit clinical at times, although it was very, very dynamic. I found transients came through, they seemed to be much cleaner, much more impactful, but ultimately it seemed like it was missing something. It wasn't drawing me into the music in quite the way that I'm used to being drawn in, but there were definitely benefits to that device. Now, compared to the Gaia, what did the Gaia do? Well, the cleanliness that the Synapse did was a bit of an illusion, because when I listened with the Gaia, I realized that there was actually more information than I could hear from the Synapse. There was more inner detail. There was more sense of the space in which the music was existing. If it was in a hall, I could sense the sound of the hall a little bit better. There was more texture. The texture had more shimmer, more bloom, more vibrancy, a greater sense of presence. The textures just made it feel more real. The bass was a bit more big. It was a bit more confident, yet had lost none of the tightness, I found. There was more rhythmic flow. It just felt more alive, more cohesive. I just felt a little more connected to the music, a little more drawn in. Now, given the price difference, I would expect there to be a difference there. But as I say, there was a benefit with the Synapse, but the Gaia definitely won this competition. So match number two, I thought, let's make this a bit more fair. So at this point, I compared the Synapse and I put it up against the SMSL PO100. And in that case, you've already heard what I said about the Synapse in terms of it's a cleaner signal, tighter bass, a bit clinical sounding. For the P100 Pro, the key benefit where I found it really sounded best with its I2S was where I found the biggest improvement. When I went with the optical, it seemed a little bit almost congested, a little bit diffuse, not as decisive as it was when it was I2S. When it was I2S, it would just seem very well delineated. Everything seemed really, well controlled. With the optical, it just felt a little fuzzier around the edges. That's probably the best way of putting it. With bass, as I said, the Synapse was a little bit too tight and almost small sounding. The P100 Pro had a deeper bass, a fuller bass, a better sense of rhythm. It was more balanced overall. It just seemed like it just made more sense. So there definitely was a benefit for the SMSL P100 versus the Synapse unit. And if you are going to go for one or the other, I definitely prefer the SMSL. It's got a lot more flexibility. And of course, if you have issues with, some people have problems with the ground loops and they've got a hum going on. If you are using the optical from the SMSL, it most definitely would solve that. I don't have a ground loop problem, so I can't determine whether or not it also does galvanic isolation for the RCA and I2S outputs. So perhaps it does. But certainly, if you have a ground loop problem, the optical would solve that as well. So between the two of those, SMSL for sure. And then I did one more test of the Gaia directly compared against the PO100 Pro. In this case, they are both DDCs. I tried them I2S versus I2S. I tried I2S versus optical on one side and then swapped them around on the other side and tried the various different options. The ability of the DAC itself to accept many of these inputs varies from DAC to DAC. So in the case of, I mentioned the benchmark DAC2 HGC earlier, In that case, its optical input virtually always sounds better than its coaxial input does. It just does. But with my Ferrum Wandla, the optical and coaxial are neck and neck. They never sound different. They always sound exactly the same. But with the Ferrum Wandla, the AES EBU signal sounds better than the other two if you're using SPDIF. And then with it, I2S always sounds better. So comparing the Gaia back and forth, I wanted to make sure it was even playing field. So I swapped things around, tried to do this versus that, and just to make sure that all the things would be properly balanced in terms of the benefits. So what did I get? They actually sounded remarkably similar, which is surprising considering one is 30 times the price of the other. But there was a difference. In terms of the Gaia, it had more sense of space, more sense of the room. You felt more like things were right there. Things were just a little more full and natural. Voices, they just seemed right somehow. Whereas the P100 Pro sounded very good, but there was just something a little bit artificial about it. Edges just seemed a little bit etched rather than being sort of naturally shaped. It's like a little bit rough here and there. But considering the price difference, remarkably similar, really similar. So those are the three comparisons I did. I should mention also the Denafrips Gaia is the one I've got currently. I have had the Denafrips Iris in the past as well. And I would say that the Iris is also better than the P100 Pro, but of course not as good as the Gaia. And the one thing to note here is the Iris is much like the PO100 Pro in that they are USB input only. In the case of the Gaia, and this is one of its strengths, not only does it sound a little bit better, but it'll support not just USB input, but you can also input an optical connection, a coax RCA connection, an AES EBU connection. In fact, it actually has two AES EBU inputs. So you could use it to support all of your digital sources. So if you only have one and it happens to be USB, you might just want to go with an Iris, and a used Iris you can get for about, I'm going to say $400 Canadian. So it may be 4 times the cost of the PO100, brand new. So I would say the benefits, if you can afford that extra money, then that's a worthwhile thing to go with the Iris rather than the PO100. But if all you can afford is a PO100, it's a great option. My conclusions for each of these devices: the Synapse, definitely better than straight USB. It maintains the same connection so that you don't have to reprogram your source device to talk to the DAC, which can be a little confusing sometimes. And it's very inexpensive. And then of course does the very important thing of galvanic isolation, which is critically important in some systems where you've got a ground loop happening somewhere. The P100 Pro sounds better than the Synapse. It's got a lot of those benefits, especially if you're using the I2S output. The galvanic isolation, not clear to me whether it works with all the outputs, but certainly does with the optical side. The Gaia is the best of the bunch. And if you can afford it, and if you have a bunch of digital sources, it becomes a pretty easy decision as to which one you'll want to go to. But again, when we're talking digital audio, the differences between these things is not massive. They are the kind of difference that when you sit and listen for a while, you can sense it. If you have something that's not quite as good and you're sitting there listening and you realize you're just not enjoying the music as much, and then you switched over to the other one, and a week later you know for a fact that it is better. And it's remarkable. I find there should not be a difference. Digital should be just ones and zeros. It should be perfect. But ultimately, when you listen and just try and open your mind and see how it impacts you and just try and get a sense of that, there's a good chance that you will tell the difference. And you will prefer one versus the other, and then it's just a matter of deciding how important it is for you to spend money on this versus that. Ultimately, all of the things that I'm recommending and telling you here are based upon my own personal perceptions. I am just one person with one opinion. I hope you don't decide you must buy this because of what I said or somebody else said. If at all possible, you want to go out there and try these things out. And that's the real benefit of something like the JDS Labs Synapse and the PO100 Pro from SMSL. They are so inexpensive that you can go out and buy them. And especially in the case of the SMSL, the PO100 Pro, you can get it from Amazon. Try it out, keep it for a couple weeks, compare it to what you're doing normally, and see if it works for you. If you're not happy with the changes, if you can't tell, probably good for you because it means you're going to save yourself some money down the road. But if you can hear a difference, you will have a sense as to the kinds of differences that a DDC can bring to your system. And then you can decide, do you want to save up for something bigger, whether that's a Denafrips Iris or the Gaia or the many, many other DDCs that are now starting to show up on the horizon. Hopefully that helps clarify things, makes the world make a little more sense to you. Always happy to share the information that I've got, and I hope you have yourselves a great day.